everybody, and welcome to the all new Crash Formula One podcast. I'm your host, Ian Mangan, and joining me is Lucas Cochran. The
Hello.
summer break is finally over, and in just a few days, we go racing again in Zandvoort. It's been a dominant season for McLaren so far, with the Papaya team leading the championship with a whopping 559 points, winning 11 out of the 14 races this season. But the Drivers' Championship is very much all to play for, with the two McLaren teammates neck and neck as we head into the second half of the season. And meanwhile, the latest news coming from the paddock that has got everybody talking is, of course, Cadillac F1 team finally confirming its lineup for their 2026 entry, with Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas making their return to Formula One. So we've got lots to get through today, Lucas. But I just wanted to get started off and tell me your thoughts about the season so far. How have you enjoyed it so far?
Well, it's lovely to have a proper tight battle at the top of the field once again. I don't think we've had anything close to that since the infamous 2021 season. And this is the first battle intra-team that I have in recent memory. And it's really exciting to see two young drivers back at it again. Obviously, in 2021, it was Lewis who was on his way out of Mercedes, arguably at the top of his game then. Less so this year, but I'm sure we'll get onto that later. But even still, it's nice to see the differences between the two young drivers, and not just in skill, but in temperament. But again, I think we'll get onto that later too.
So, as you said, Lucas, it's been really tight between the two McLaren drivers. I think what kind of surprised us most at the start of this season is basically how much Oscar has just come out of the blocks and just really, really impressed. Obviously, he's had a really, really strong couple of years in Formula One, but I think Lando definitely came into this season being the favourite, especially considering the number of clashes he had with Max and how close the championship was with him last year. It definitely looked like that he was the man to beat this year, but it seems he's actually struggled a little bit, and Oscar has looked very cool, calm, collected. That being said, I know that, of course, Lando has had some very, very impressive performances. His last kind of outing in Hungary was phenomenal. He didn't really put a foot wrong, really. But just 9 points separates the two drivers. And as we head into this latter half of the season, I mean, I guess the question is, who do we think is most likely to clinch the title?
Well, I mean, obviously both drivers are still young, and Lando does have just a hair more experience than Oscar does. But from where I'm sitting, I don't know if you'd actually ever really be able to know it. Um, I find that with Oscar, he, as you said, tends to keep much more calm and collected when he gets set back. Lando is a phenomenal driver in his own right, but whenever he does have a setback, I feel like, and I imagine quite a few people feel like, it does set him on the back foot for quite a while thereafter. Whereas Oscar seems to just jump back, straight back on the horse and come back fighting the next season, or rather the next race. Lando went from no wins to the one in Miami last year, which was a great confidence boost for him, and he was fighting with Max for the rest of the season thereafter. And this year, yes, we were expecting him to come out fighting much harder than he did. Oscar is, again, he has great management in Mark Webber, and he's clearly got a great team behind him. I imagine they both do. But again, where they are pretty much neck and neck on skill, I feel like Oscar edges out with the temperament and his ability to just handle and roll with the punches. I think it's going to be very interesting to develop thereafter.
Yeah, it's been really interesting this season. Obviously, there was kind of some kind of very big flashpoints, even going back to last year, going back to Oscar's first win in Hungary, of course. We knew that flashpoint where, Norris being basically begged by his team to give the position back. So we kind of knew that these flashpoints would kind of come again and again. We haven't seen it really explode between the two McLaren teammates this year for sure. But I think I'd agree with you that Oscar has definitely got that kind of more measured temperament. Lando's always the kind of guy who's very self-critical whenever he has a bad weekend, or he misses pole by a tenth or half a tenth. He's very critical of himself, and he'll openly say that in the media all the time. I think what we've kind of come to realize with Norris is that he does really have that raw pace, that raw speed when it comes down to it. But sometimes I just think being able to put that whole weekend together and have that kind of amazing Saturday, amazing Sunday can sometimes get away from him a little bit. And if things go slightly wrong, he kind of struggles to kind of then pick them back up again, pick up those pieces. Whereas I think, as you said, Oscar has shown that he's very calm, very measured.
Going back to what you're saying with flashpoints for a second, I really am inclined to agree, and it's a great testament to Zach and Andrea's management of the team in that they've managed to avoid these moments of infighting and prioritizing the success of the team over the success of a single driver. It's especially exemplary last race in Hungary, where Lando benefited from a stroke of luck in the tyre strategy call and ended up coming out on top over Oscar. Granted, there were some words had after that, but even still, there was nothing that really flared up out of it. It was largely accepted that it was for the benefit of the team, and yes, one driver locked out over the other, but this is just the nature of the game, isn't it? But yeah, I think it's going to be a very, very close fight up ahead. Obviously, we're separated now by less than 10 points, and unless something absolutely catastrophic happens, I'm pretty sure that the Constructors' Championship is going the way of McLaren like it did last year, and that is great testament to both the drivers and the management of the team. We haven't seen anything even close to what we had with Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton in the early days of the turbo hybrid era of Mercedes, where they were really, really close. I mean, Nico got his championship and got out because, to be honest, I don't think I would be able to handle that sort of heat either. But the fact that these two are so close, neck and neck, we're only halfway through the season, and it is still all to play for, and yet there haven't really been any major driver beefs or controversies is great, great testament to McLaren. So I've got to take my hat.
Yeah, I think you're right. McLaren also just, as you say, just look like a really, really strong racing outfit at the moment. I think what probably helped them was knowing how strong they were heading into this season.
Hmm.
I think that it's been pretty clear. Andrea Stella, the team principal, has kind of made it clear that they had the conversation with the two drivers that they are both racing each other throughout the whole season. There's not going to be too many calls on prioritizing any driver until it hits a point in the season where it becomes evident that one of them is going to win. We have not hit that point yet. As you said, there's less than 10 points separating the two drivers. We might never come to that point. And I mean, hopefully for all us viewers at home, it does come down to the very last race, which I think what we would all want to see a last lap decision for the championship this year as well.
I
So
think I think that's a very important distinction to make as well. Ordinarily, in driver setups in teams, we always expect the standard first driver and second driver format. McLaren have somehow managed to completely buck that trend. They haven't shown any sort of favoritism. When Lando was in the lead early on in the season, there was maybe a tiny bit of preference towards his end of the garage, but now that we're here, they still haven't said who they prefer. They just even Stevens, both in priority in the team and in the championship. That's a really rare sight, and it hasn't really started anything that we would deem to be to the detriment of the team. And I think in the F1 paddock, that is pretty much unheard of. So again, props to them for somehow managing to figure out that one.
yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, going back to what you said about flashpoints, obviously there was that collision in Canada between Lando and Oscar, but immediately Lando threw his hands up and said, look, that was my mistake. And I think even things like that has really helped them progress throughout the season, pretty much keeping their noses clean. I'm sure that there is 100% underlying tensions there as well. At
Of
the end of the
course.
day, these are both drivers who want to win their first championship. And I think it's definitely probably been a little bit more difficult for Lando in ways, considering that he was the favorite coming into this season. Oscar has shown on multiple weekends that potentially he might, have the better of him. But I think there's been some really, really impressive Norris performances as well. And I think a big thing is his confidence. When he has those really, really strong weekends, he comes back even stronger than the following weekend. So I'm really excited to see what happens in Zandvoort, basically. But moving on, of course, McLaren aren't the only team in this championship, although, as you said, Lucas, it looks like they'll be very comfortably winning the constructors this year, and probably the drivers. It's been interesting. All the other kind of top teams have really struggled this year in general, really. Coming on to the team that is currently second in the standings, Ferrari. Obviously, this year, huge year for Ferrari. They had signed Lewis Hamilton, probably the biggest F1 news in a long, long time. Huge expectations on Hamilton entering this season, and huge expectations on Ferrari in general, considering how strongly they finished the last season. Obviously, they had that kind of difficult middle patch throughout the season, but you know winning that many races towards the end of the season was really, really impressive. And it just felt like Ferrari would be that real title contender this year. And it felt like all the ingredients would be there for Lewis to maybe make that charge for his eighth world championship. Unfortunately, that's not been the case at all. Ferrari in general, I think, have struggled, as have the other top teams. But I mean, Lucas, we have to get on to the kind of the elephant in the room. Lewis Hamilton struggles at Ferrari. What do you think has gone wrong, really?
I think, to be honest, let me just start by saying I think the Ferrari did I say masochists? I mean fans have been really, really tenacious in the last few years. They've always held out hope, and every year it seems like Ferrari are getting even closer to being top of the table, really competitive. And granted, this year, let's not take it away from them, they are still P2 in the Constructors' Championship, so hats off to them for that. I am just really disappointed to see how Lewis has been performing. Obviously, his performance towards his latter days at Mercedes weren't all that great anyway. Um, and the way I see it, we've always heard Lewis talking about dreaming of driving at Ferrari for years and years and years. Since the early days of Mercedes, I mean, that's part of the reason why he was always so close with Niki Lauda with his Ferrari history. And I see his move to Ferrari, and I don't know if this is controversial to say, but it's getting towards the end of his career, isn't it? I think Lewis might be potentially winding down in a few years, but as far as I'm concerned, this is his way of completing that dream and completing his career in Formula One, which is great. That doesn't, however, excuse his performance. We've also had the oldest driver on the grid at the moment, Fernando Alonso, over at Aston Martin, knocking performances out of the park, especially when you consider the performance of the car that he's in. Lewis, on the other hand, has very much struggled to integrate properly with the Ferrari team, and that is unfortunately represented in his performance as well. He's been regularly outperformed by his teammate Charles Leclerc, who, granted, has been at the team for a much longer time than he has, so is both better integrated with the personnel, the facilities, and, of course, most crucially, the car. But again, one would expect a 7.5-time world champion, as it were, to have a much easier time adapting to new machinery. And I think it is a shame to see him struggle so badly, because I, as much as the next man, really want him to do well, as a Brit especially.
Yeah, I think as well, the thing with Hamilton was obviously there was huge hype around him coming to Ferrari. I think I agree with you with his kind of latter stint with Mercedes post 21. Was very much a mixed bag. You know, he kind of struggled against George Russell in that first year that Russell was driving full time for Mercedes. Was kind of, quite a bit stronger than Russell in 23, I think. And then 24, it really just felt like towards the end, he was kind of, he'd had his time with Mercedes. He was kind of, a bit checked out and maybe not willing to push those performances that we kind of been used to. And his mind was on a new project. I mean, we need to remember as well that he had signed with Ferrari an entire year in advance. So he drove that entire last year with Mercedes with the knowledge that I am moving to Ferrari by the end of it. But look, it has been a real struggle. And I agree, Ferrari is still second in the championship. That car is not. It's a difficult car to drive, I think, in the sense that it's unpredictable. The team has been really struggling with basically finding consistent performance. There's been plenty of weekends where, they look really strong in practice and really strong in qualifying, and pace just falls off then on the Sunday. I think a lot of that is down to potentially setup and ride height, which Ferrari has kind of downplayed massively. But it definitely feels like overall Ferrari have under-delivered on their package this year, compared to last year and how close that they had come to McLaren towards the end of the year as well. But I think you're right. Lewis is just struggling in that team. He's not really been able to put it together, and I think he's struggling with his confidence a little bit as well. Lewis again is another kind of character who wears his heart on his sleeve, and is very open about how he feels when he has a bad performance. I mean, there's been times where he's said very, very dour things to the media after. He's said I'm slow. He's said they should get another driver, they need to change their driver and things like that. I think as well, I mean, sometimes a little bit of that gets a little bit overplayed because they're fresh out of the car, they've had a bad race, they've had a bad qualifying session. Their adrenaline is pumping, so they tend to maybe say things to the media that would maybe pull back on in hindsight. But it does feel like 100% Lewis is aware that he's not performing at Charles's level. I mean, it was interesting because he had quite a strong start to the season. Obviously, there was that sprint win in China, which was really, really impressive. But we've seen Charles has been on the podium a couple of times. Lewis has yet to score a Grand Prix podium with Ferrari, and I think he's chasing that even. He wants to stand up on that step with Ferrari. It's been interesting as well. Frederick Vasseur, the team principal, who, to be honest with you, I think has made incredible inroads with Ferrari, especially given the kind of chaotic nature that they're known for as an organization. He, of course, replaced Mattia Binotto as team principal. And I think that overall he's done a pretty good job with Ferrari in kind of making that organization a bit more of a well-oiled machine, making it run like a proper Formula One team where weekend in, weekend out, they know what they're doing, they know what their strategies are. They've improved even their pit stops massively over the years. But it just does feel like that potentially Vasseur underestimated how easily Hamilton would slot into the team. He's admitted that himself. He kind of said, we assumed that Lewis would have it all under control. We potentially underestimated that. He's only basically raced in British-based teams, obviously McLaren and then Mercedes. So even being part of the Italian outfit is been a big change to them too. But it doesn't seem that, Vasseur has completely given up hope on the project just yet either. I think that it will be very telling how Hamilton, fares the second half of the season.
Hmm.
I mean, ultimately as well, there's been a lot of chatter about does he even compete in 26? I mean, I think he would be crazy not to even just see what kind of package Ferrari come together with a massive regulations change in 26. That being said, though, it does feel like his performances have been underwhelming, and I know that there's been a lot of chatter about is this the end of his career. I do just want to go back to the Fernando Alonso thing. I think that Fernando has been really, really, really impressive, especially since his move to Aston Martin. But there's been plenty of weekends this year where he struggled. He was being outqualified by Stroll very early on, and let's face it, Stroll is not the same kind of teammate as someone like Charles Leclerc. Um, putting it lightly. But the reality is, I think that Alonso does sometimes face less scrutiny than Lewis Hamilton purely because of Hamilton's success. I mean, 7-time world champion, you're of course going to be scrutinized that bit more than, say, a 2-time world champion. But Fernando Alonso is someone that drives at an incredibly high level, and I think that Lewis is still capable of driving at that high level. I think also as well, one of the big frustrations with Lewis has been qualifying over the last couple of years. I think we've still seen some really good performances on Sundays, but it's just sometimes extracting that raw pace on a Saturday.
Yeah, it can be tricky like that. I mean, going back to what you were saying with Lewis wearing his heart on his sleeve, I do feel at this point that Lewis feels he doesn't have anything to prove. And to be fair, he really doesn't. He's done it all. He's got pretty much every record you could possibly think of and related to Formula One is held by Lewis Hamilton. And I think that's fair enough. And some may say that that's sort of him not necessarily trying or caring. I don't think that's necessarily the case. At the end of the day, he's still a Formula One driver and he still has competition at heart. It's just how easy or difficult he finds to action that in the surroundings that he's in. And yes, Fernando does not necessarily have as much of an expectation on his back, but there is that. But there is also the possibility that that is aiding him. I mean, he doesn't necessarily feel as much pressure. He's not got as many eyes on him. And as such, he doesn't have as much pressure under which to crack, right? Whereas Lewis doesn't have as much to prove, but does have those expectations, both from us as Brits and from the Tifosi, who we know are pretty ruthless with both their teammates and their people who aren't on the team alike. Yeah, it's definitely proven tricky as an adjustment, and I don't know if there's necessarily anyone on the grid who is in a similar situation to have a direct apples-to-apples comparison with. So all the best of luck to him, I say. But yeah, I'm definitely watching.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting, I think, for the second half of the season. And look, it is worth noting that I think that Charles has put in some really good performances this year, but there's no doubt that he's struggled too. He's been quite vocal about things need to change in the team as well. And we know that while Charles has a lot of loyalty to Ferrari, he is becoming increasingly more critical of the team as the years have gone on. Due to obviously frustrations with, he feels that he can win a championship. They come agonizing close every year, and then they come into a new season and they struggle again. And Charles has been pretty blunt about some of the struggles that Ferrari have experienced this year. But that being said, Charles has still had some quite impressive performances this year. As I said, he stood on the podium a couple of times. He's able to still put together a couple of good races, in comparison to Lewis too. So I think it will be really, really interesting to one, watch how Lewis performs in the second half of the season, but also just, how he measures up against Charles. And I think as well, potentially, maybe people underestimated how he would fare against Charles. I mean, I think you could argue that Charles is, the fastest over a lap in Formula One at the moment. He's really, really impressive in his qualifying performances. He is damn fast. That being said, he has struggled just as much on certain weekends as well. He's had some very, very bad weekends as well. So it's interesting to see that both of the drivers have struggled with this current setup, with this current car. And I think really the second half of the season, it'll be difficult to even get an indication of where Ferrari is headed for then 26, basically, because of that regulation change. But I think
Yeah.
what everyone will be watching is how does Lewis perform against Charles in these final few races.
And of course, with the second half of the season, we get a lot more upgrades from teams. It's generally the point where teams are most familiar with the car for that year, and as such, things tend to get better. We do also often see switch ups with which teams are strongest going into the second half of the season as teams bring upgrades along. I'm not saying that all of a sudden we're going to see Ferrari with the fastest car on the grid, or that we're going to see a Ferrari championship of any kind this year. That's not necessarily true. But even still, I think the competition is going to get closer yet. And I think it's important not to overstate the difference in performance, especially as the numbers go, between Charles and Lewis. I mean, the delta right now is, I think, was it 42 points, which sounds like a lot, but to be honest, it's really not that major. If they were to say have 4 races where there is a massive delta in the opposite direction, Lewis could end up on top. So it is still very much all to play for. It's just based on what we've seen so far, I don't know that I would project Lewis finishing this season in a particularly happy way. All that being said, yes, you are right in that 2026 is going to be a very, very interesting year when it comes to the introduction of brand new regulations. Yet again, it feels like only yesterday that we got the new ground effect rules through. But even still, it's going to be very exciting to see how things move forward. And to be honest, I am quite glad we are seeing more regular regulation changes, just because it shakes things up more often. It's rarer these days to see a single team dominate for multiple years in a row. I mean, only last year Red Bull were on top, and it was McLaren who were the underdog. And yet here we are a year later, where McLaren seem almost completely untouchable. So as long as the competition carries on and we keep seeing new things and new winners, I'm happy.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots and lots to look forward to throughout the second half of the season and into the next season. Moving on, Lucas, I just want to talk briefly then about Mercedes, Lewis's ex-team. Obviously, they had a very interesting driver lineup change this year. Replacing Lewis Hamilton was never going to be a very easy task. But of course, they've also had a very, very promising driver, George Russell, driving for them since 22. But of course, this year they brought on rookie, the very, very much hyped Kimi Antonelli. I want to start really quickly talking about George first. I mean, I think his performance has been really, really strong this year. He's been very, very consistent. But the big talking point has been still no contract for next year with Mercedes.
Yeah, that's a tricky one to touch on. Obviously, there are all of these rumors circulating about maybe Max to Mercedes, which I think would have been very interesting indeed, especially with the internal struggles that Red Bull have been facing lately. But I imagine we'll get onto that a bit later. Though during that time, it was clear that George wasn't necessarily set to continue at Mercedes going into next year. Now that those Max rumors have been quelled a little bit, I think it's much more likely that we will see George carried on. It's just that these things haven't been announced yet. What's going on internally, we may never know because I don't work at Mercedes. But moving forwards, I think we can expect an announcement for a contract extension rather soon. George, as always, has been very level-headed. When it comes to race performance, I find he's generally a little bit quicker on Saturday than he is on Sunday, but that's not necessarily a problem as long as he can qualify high enough. What happens on Sunday sometimes, especially at some races on the calendar, is already settled. But yeah, George has a similar temperament to Oscar in that when something goes wrong, sure, it will get him down on the day. I mean, need I remind you of the Sakir Grand Prix back in the day when he very, very nearly won it and then got lost due to a tyre issue. But even still, I think he's very much at the peak of his form at the moment. Whether or not he has the car to back that up is up to Mercedes next year, I guess. But as for this year, I think he's done pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, he is one of the few drivers that's actually won a Grand Prix this year outside of McLaren. So, he's been very, very impressive. I think that, stepping up to that first challenge of going up against Lewis Hamilton was always going to be difficult for him, which he's fared fantastically well, I think. And I think this year was going to be interesting to see, like, could he really step into that kind of team leader role? I think George is the kind of guy who just naturally has a lot of kind of leadership qualities and is eager to step into that kind of position with the team. He works well with the team. The team are always very complimentary of George. Toto Wolff is obviously the kind of guy who does love his prodigies. He loves his projects that he can work on. And while George is that really steady, safe pair of hands, Toto Wolff continuously kicks himself that he didn't sign Max Verstappen back when he had the opportunity all those years ago when Max was first entering the F1 grid. And I think that basically leads on to why he decided to take the chance with the very promising Kimi Antonelli. Antonelli obviously has had a very interesting kind of entry into F1. He obviously skipped F3, went straight into F2. Had a kind of an interesting year in F2 with his going up against his teammate Ollie Behrman, both of them racing for Prema. The team obviously kind of had struggled with their car actually, but I think Kimi had put in some very decent performances throughout his F2 career. But the pressure was obviously very, very high coming into F1. I think so far, considering his age, he's done very well. He has impressed on a number of weekends. But I guess my main concern about Kimi is the highs haven't been as high as I think people are expecting right now. And I also think there is some consistency problems with his weekends. There can be those weekends where he's very, very impressive, and then there's those weekends where he's absolutely nowhere as well. He has struggled in qualifying a number of times, and then oftentimes when he struggled in qualifying, the race doesn't come together for him then either. That being said, as I said, there has been some great highs. I think for how much hype has been put on to Kimi, potentially I was expecting those highs to be even higher again. But look, it is still very early days. I guess the question is, Lucas, how do you think he has fared this season? And do you think that Mercedes should be keeping him on 26 and beyond?
Well, a lot of people are viewing Kimi as a bit of a phenom. He's sort of been dropped straight into the deep end of Formula One. And we forget that that is a lot of pressure for a driver to be put under, especially when you consider that he's completely skipped the junior teams of the Mercedes program. He was given no time in a Williams, unlike George, who had a rather steady build up to his Mercedes premiership, whereas Andrea Kimi has just straight away hit the ground running. I wasn't expecting him to be as performant as George, who has a good few years of Formula One experience over Kimi. However, he has joined the team and gotten along with everything remarkably well. He seems to just put his head down and perform. Yes, sometimes that does lead to mistakes in the race. I just think that a lot of the time, people let their hype for Kimi and their hopes for him outweigh the fact that he is still very much a rookie in this sport. And I think, all things considered, he's doing a very, very good job. I do also think that he's going to be continuing at Mercedes going into the next few years. It is strange to me that it was George who was called into questioning as opposed to Kimi when it came to the question of signing Max. Obviously, Kimi is a very new signing, so booting him out of the team straight away after his first year may feel a little bit unfair, but again, this is Formula One, isn't it? And we need look no further in the paddock than Red Bull to see just how quickly these things can change for or against any specific driver. I don't think Toto has it in him to do the sorts of mid-season sackings we've seen from the Horner days of Red Bull, but even still, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, and all things considered, I think Kimi is doing a remarkable job at holding his own.
Yeah, I think what you've touched on there as well is him actually just being able to keep a level head as well. For his age, that was always going to be a concern. Those maturity levels, there's lots to get to grips with a team like Mercedes, an outfit that big, with that much success, and stepping into a car that was previously driven by Lewis Hamilton is always going to be huge. I think Kimi has been very good at keeping that level head. When he has his bad weekends, you're right, he does just kind of put his head down and move on to the next weekend. He doesn't really let it continue on. He's eager to learn. The team have been very complimentary of him as well. Age is always going to be a difficult thing. You're always going to get that pulled up on, essentially. We mustn't forget as well that George had an incredibly impressive junior career and has been very impressive all throughout his Formula One career. Obviously, it was, I think, very difficult to gauge some of George's performances with those first few years at Williams, just given how much that team was in disarray. But he stepped into Mercedes fantastically. He's done really, really well consistently over the 3 years. So I think that Kimi Antonelli also going up against George was another kind of double edged sword that he had to jump into. So while I've probably been a little bit harsh in saying that his heights haven't really been hit, I do agree with you that he is a very, very strong driver, and I think that Mercedes should, stick with him into 26. And I agree, it was interesting that actually George's name was being tossed into the mix there of, will he be dropped if Max was signed to Mercedes? I think in that instance as well was, we know that Toto Wolff loves a project. He loves this idea of a prodigy coming in and, being this kind of world beater, essentially. And I think that was probably feeding into potentially some of these conversations. And also what we're forgetting is as well is Russell would have a lot more stock in the driver market than someone like Kimi would as well.
Yeah.
I'm sure that George was exploring some options as well, just for his own sake too. As we both said, I think that this conversation is probably irrelevant considering that they're both going to be signed anyway. But it was just really interesting to see some of those early movements in the driver market before they got signed. But yeah, I think it'll be really, really interesting to see how one Kimi fares for the rest of the season, and I'm interested to see how Mercedes fares for the rest of the season. I think they've probably disappointed a little bit coming into this season too. There was some really, really strong weekends for them last year too, and I was probably a little bit more hopeful that they would be a little bit more competitive this year. Although that being said, I think most teams are, underperforming up against
Mm.
McLaren this year. They just really are just an absolutely dominant force in the sport at the moment. That being said, I think that next year as well will be really telling. There's lots of talk about Mercedes having an incredibly strong power unit next year, which will be the one to watch, and it would be really interesting to see both how Kimi and George get on from there. But moving on then, Lucas, we do have to talk about, of course, the current reigning world champion, Max Verstappen, and how he's been faring this year with Red Bull. There's been a lot of chaos in that team. It's been a really interesting year for Max, a lot of frustrations. Of course, Max came into the season, after performing incredibly well. I think last year was arguably his best championship win. Coming into this season, obviously there was a lot of pressure on the team. There's been a lot of brain drain in Red Bull over the years. Of course, first losing people like Rob Marshall and then Adrian Newey, of course. They looked like that team were struggling with that car towards the end of the year, but Max was still putting together really good weekends and ultimately clinched the title. This year, it became evident pretty soon into the season that Max was not going to be in contention for the championship.
Mm.
I think has been one, difficult for him to accept, but two, has had a real ripple effect into what's happened to that team. Obviously, Christian Horner being sacked in July, replaced with Laurent Mekies.
Yeah,
Start this.
it's been really tricky over there, hasn't it? I mean, obviously there's been a lot of infighting between the GmbH and the Thai sides of Red Bull, both pro Horner, pro Jos Verstappen, the Verstappens versus everybody. It's a massive, massive mess, really, isn't it? Let's be honest. How they navigate that hasn't necessarily been the best executed. Obviously, with Christian Horner's exit from the team, that's a whole other kettle of fish that I don't know if we have quite the time to get into today. But it's very clear that things at Red Bull are very unstable. And for any driver, not just Max, who has familial ties to the team at this point with his father, it's going to be a tricky environment to perform in. Both for drivers and for team members alike. Obviously, you've already mentioned that they've had a lot of brain drain. A lot of the top talent from Red Bull has gone to pastures greener, I suppose, especially when you consider Aston Martin and Adrian Newey. So yeah, it's incredibly, incredibly tricky. The car, I don't think, has necessarily been quite up to scratch this year either. But again, that becomes less important. I think it's important to consider this year with teams that they might not necessarily be putting all of their resources into this year's car as focus starts to shift onto the new regulations introduced for next year. I think Red Bull are probably making that shift over, especially with their new engine development facilities that they're working on. And yeah, it's going to be very tricky, especially with Mercedes making claims of having such a strong power unit, lest we forget that they are the biggest supplier of engines on the grid at the moment. And so it makes a lot of sense that they'd be putting a lot of focus there.
Yeah, it's a lot of question marks, really, isn't it? I mean, Max has been very vocal about his frustrations with the team. Obviously, Horner's exit was huge news within the F1 paddock. I mean, he basically built that team up from the start and had seen tons of success, but it became very evident that, he was to go. I think that since he's left, Max has reaffirmed his commitment to the team. He has
Hmm.
said that he will be staying with Red Bull till 26, but as we mentioned earlier, Lucas, there was plenty of chatter about will Max move to Mercedes? Will Max leave F1 entirely? Was still very much a question. I think as well what you touched on with Red Bull, investing heavily in their own, engine department is still a massive question mark as well. It's a huge undertaking to develop your own engine. And I think they are the biggest question mark heading into the next season as well. I think Max has accepted, the championship is out of reach this year, but he will be eager to see what they can come up with next year. Laurent Mekies, of course, from Racing Bulls, was kind of parachuted in typical Red Bull fashion. Whenever someone is kind of pulled out of the main Red Bull team, they do some shuffling around on the Racing Bulls team. What I will say is Laurent Mekies is obviously a very respected character. He, was very well respected with his time in Racing Bulls. He was, of course, with Ferrari prior to that. Red Bull had pipped him from Ferrari, which Fred Vasseur was vocally very unhappy about, so he was a big loss to that team. And I think that he is a safe pair of hands to put the Red Bull Racing outfit, to put in charge of the Red Bull Racing outfit. There's of course the fact that they also lost Jonathan Wheatley as well, a racing director who, is now heading up the Stake Sauber team, which is soon to be Audi next year as well. So lots and lots of big names there, and Mekis has got a lot in his hands. One, to I think, I mean, let's be real. All they have to do is deliver a good car for Max, and he will perform.
100%.
I think next year the pressure is on massively because one, they risk, maybe having a slightly disappointing year. Potentially, it may not be the entire year. It may not be the fact that they're completely losing every single race, but it might be evident that they won't be in championship contention. And within that, they run the risk then of losing Max. Without Max, then where does that put them? I mean, look at the situation with their second seat. Um,
Yeah.
Obviously, Liam Lawson started out the year, two races he lasted before Yuki Tsunoda was then swapped out of Racing Bulls and Liam was put back into Racing Bulls then. Yuki has struggled massively, really, on the team as well. And I mean, you really just have to look at the standings, really. I mean,
Yeah, it is
the
tricky. That second seat has been the hottest seat in Formula One just because drivers keep coming in and out of it. It's so popular in that regard, but also hot because no one seems to be able to sit in it for very long. It's very tricky, isn't it? I mean, Liam Lawson, bless him, had all the ambitions in the world and all the promise. As soon as he was announced to be replacing Checo, it was flipping him off in Mexico. It was, he was the big I am until it actually came to sitting in that seat. And I think a lot of drivers dream of sitting in that seat, but very few actually understand the experience of what it is like to be playing second fiddle to Max. Everybody seems to claim that car is made for Max, and to be honest, it kind of should be, considering he is the incumbent. He is the one who has given the team the most success over the years, and I think it's tricky to expect a new driver to be able to come along and pick up exactly where he is, because again, he is the dominant force that is Max Verstappen. But yeah, it's always going to be tricky, and I think Yuki has had about as hard a time as any when it comes to adapting to that seat. But even still, I think of the last goodness, how many have there been? Four or five over as many years almost. I think Yuki has probably seen the best start, which granted isn't really saying that much, but even still, especially considering what he was like during his time at Racing Bulls or AlphaTauri or whatever it was called at the time for which he was racing there.
He's a cash app Morby.
VCarb, they are now.
Yeah.
Um, Considering how perceivably immature he was, for want of a better term, during his time at VCarb slash AlphaTauri, he has come quite a long way when it comes to keeping his head down at the Red Bull team. His performance might not necessarily reflect that, but I think even still, it's tough to detract from him that he hasn't been able to step up both in maturity and in his way of managing the car.
Yeah, I think it's been very difficult. I think that Sonoda has shown a lot of maturity since stepping up to Red Bull Racing. And I think, I mean, that was one of the key things that was holding him back from ever being put into that team in the first place. Horner was pretty evidently not in favor of signing Yuki at any point, and maturity was often cited as a regular reason as to not put Yuki in that second seat. I think I agree that Yuki has definitely even improved slightly over the last couple of races, and I think that Mekis is the right man to kind of maybe lift him up, and it will be interesting to see what Mekis does with that second seat situation and tries to manage that situation. I mean, ultimately Max is still third in the championship, and again, he's one of the other few drivers that have actually won a race this season. I mean, Yuki only has 10 points, so it has been very underwhelming for him. That being said, there's been so much chaos in that team. There's been so much driver chopping and changing. It does feel that Red Bull are just kind of, digging their heels in now. They've made the decision now that Yuki is going to be in the seat for the year. It will not do us any benefit to try and launch a third driver in at this rate and try to cobble together some points. Now that they know both championships are far out of reach, it's almost been a little bit of a potentially just like an easier decision then to just go, okay, we just need to accept that, we potentially be third, fourth in the standings this year, and we just have to live with that essentially. Well, go on, Lucas, excuse me.
No, you're all good. I think it's just going to be interesting to see what happens when Red Bull does commit to something for once. I mean, a lot of the problems over the years have either led to changes in drivers or been caused by changes in drivers. So sometimes it's good to be able to take a step back, look at the situation that you have both with car, drivers and team, and see how it works out for the year. If things need to be changed, then by all means do that next year, or maybe even wait around a little more and see how things develop, because anything can happen, right? But I think it is nice to see some semblance of calm amid the chaos that is happening at Red Bull at the moment.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like Mekis has really hit the ground running. I mean, it was evident there that he was clearing house, hiring a lot of new people into that team. So I think he's got a big task on his hand. But as I said, he's a very competent, very capable, I should say, actually more so than competent guy to run a team. So he's been in the sport for many, many years. So it will be really interesting to see what they do. And I think as well, Max is someone that never to write off throughout the rest of the season. I think that there is every reason to believe that Max could come away with a couple of more Grand Prix wins throughout the second half of the season. It's felt quite weird actually seeing him, being this far behind throughout the season. We have not seen this in a long time. But I think that kind of adds to the entertainment too, because Max might still pull out an absolutely blinding performance one weekend against the two McLaren drivers. And I think that there has been obviously periods as well where that car has been very quick. There's, I think, potentially it's overplayed how bad the car is. Essentially, obviously, it's a difficult car to drive. We know that other drivers have struggled with it, but that doesn't mean that it's not a fast car. And I think that Max being able to pull out the odd performance still in there will still add to that kind of intrigue and where they go from here. Speaking of drivers who have struggled, of course, it moves us on neatly then to one Checo Perez, who is making a return to the grid this year. Obviously, Sergio Perez was dropped from Red Bull the end of last year. Despite having already actually signed a contract for 25 with Red Bull, the team had decided that it was time to part ways with Checo due to his performances. He was struggling to keep up with Max. But I think potentially, Lucas, he's maybe one of the few drivers in history whose stock has actually gone up in F1 after leaving the grid. He's obviously making a triumphant return now with the Cadillac
Yep.
F1 team alongside none other than Valtteri Bottas, who was obviously previously driving for Stake Sauber. Before that, he was driving with Mercedes as Lewis Hamilton's teammate. He's taken a year out as a reserve driver with Mercedes, but I think everyone is very happy to see him back in a full time drive. And I think the two of these will be interesting to see against each other. But before we kind of get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about Perez. What do you think of him making this return? Cadillac's decision to sign him, and how he maybe feels about the Red Bull scenario over the last couple of years, and how he was dropped, and what his attitude will be like heading into the Cadillac.
Yes. It's great to see both of them back, to be honest. I, more than a lot of people, have missed Valtteri Bottas just because he is so iconic in this game. I think he's one of those drivers who knows when to take himself seriously and when to let the joke be the joke. The same goes for Perez. He's a phenomenal driver in his own right. He too has suffered the Red Bull curse, much like many drivers before him, or at least the curse of the second seat, so to speak. But you're right in that his stock has gone up while being out of the sport, which, as far as I'm aware, is pretty much unheard of outside of Michael Schumacher, perhaps. Um, but I'm not saying that Sergio Perez is the next Michael Schumacher.
Yeah, it's a bold comparison there now, Lucas. Be careful. Yeah.
But even still, I mean, obviously we remember his days back in the days of the pink Mercedes, where he went from, what was it, P20 all the way up to P1 within a single race. He's obviously got the skill for it, and I think he has been a victim of the F1 system, so to speak, in being sidelined. But I'm so glad that he's been given yet another chance to sit in a Formula One seat and prove his worth once again. One question I do want to raise with this new driver lineup is, who do we think is going to be, if there is going to be, a first seat and second seat driver? I mean, historically speaking, I know you touched on Valtteri's history at Mercedes. He's arguably one of the best second drivers this sport has ever seen in his support of Lewis through several world championships. Granted, that worked to his detriment in some points. I'm sure we all remember the infamous radio message of "To whom it may concern, blank you."
Yeah.
Um, but even still, I know he's got the skill for it. It's just whether or not he is willing to step up as that first driver. I mean, let's not also forget that Checo has also been a phenomenal second driver. So two second drivers on the same team, both with a wealth of experience, but not necessarily the table standings to prove it, are in a position to prove themselves in a brand new team. I think that is tremendously exciting, and I really can't wait to see where it goes next.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? I think, when Perez left the grid, I mean, I was guilty of this as well. I felt that he had really kind of, reached the end of his Formula One career in ways. I felt that, his performances in Red Bull, it was difficult because there was those moments of greatness. He did achieve some great things with Red Bull too. He won a couple of races, in that team as well. There was some really strong weekends. And I think now that we can see how much the other teammates are struggling, that, perhaps we all judge Perez a little bit too harshly. I think as well, there was always a bit of talk of maybe Perez coming back with a kind of a lower outfit that's looking for that experience. And I think Cadillac have just pulled a blinder signing both of these. Bottas, of course, as you say, Lucas, is, the definitive second driver in many ways. I think what you've touched on and, stepping up to that team leader role, I think he really wanted to do that with Alfa Romeo Sauber. He definitely wanted to build something with that team. He admitted in hindsight signing with them was a bad decision. I think he got a bit unlucky there, to be perfectly honest with you, just with the bit of chaos that's gone on that team and that outfit, essentially. And as you say, they've both kind of fallen victim to that circumstance in F1. So I think Cadillac have just played an absolute blinder signing these two really experienced drivers. And I think the huge enjoyment will be is who emerges as that, leader. Potentially neither of them. I think I would lean on potentially Valtteri Bottas being the stronger driver. I think he was fantastic with Mercedes over the years, and on his day, he really could beat Lewis in the same machinery. That being said, I think the two of them are probably going into that project with the same understanding that this is a brand new team. It feels, obviously it's a lot bigger, but it does feel a little bit like when Haas entered the grid, with their driver lineups, with Grosjean, when they eventually got Grosjean and Magnussen on board, while those two got very hairy and had some, real big clashes and things like that. It felt like they understand that those two drivers were, you know, could be really, really quick drivers on their day and never really had those huge successes of lots of race wins and things like that. But they wanted to build something. And I think that Bottas and Perez will be going in with that mindset. And I think, ultimately, Cadillac has come in with very big ambitions. We're not expecting much 26 from that car. They're going to have to essentially come in as a customer team. I think that they've already put in an agreement potentially early days with Ferrari to be their engine supplier earlier on. But they are going to become an engine manufacturer themselves. But they will need both the knowledge of Perez and Bottas to give them that feedback, that direction on one, how to build a car, but two, also how to run a team. These are two guys that are both part of two of the biggest F1 teams, Mercedes and Red Bull. They know what it takes to be a championship winning team, to be part of a championship winning team. And they will both bring that wealth of knowledge. I think the other thing that will be really interesting is just seeing how the two of them fight it out on the track. I'm really interested to just see who comes out on top.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, as you say, they do both have a wealth of knowledge, which is an important thing to come into a brand new team with. And yes, it is important to be pragmatic as well. 2026 is not going to necessarily be a barnstorming season for Cadillac. And yeah, they are going to be a customer team for the early days of their tenure. And I think it is also quite funny that they are potentially engine sourcing from Ferrari, who, especially in other series like WEC, have been a prime competitor for them. But even still, yeah, I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see who comes out on track. And as far as ways to start a team go, I think Cadillac are following that rule book down to a T, and I think that is really, really promising to see from them.
Yeah, I think they've just really made a really good decision. Both as well, there's obvious benefits of the fact that they're a new team, and there's obviously commercial benefits too to signing someone like Perez, who's been backed by the likes of Carlos Slim in the past. He brings a lot of money into the team as well, which that team will definitely need getting started, even though Cadillac, of course, is an absolute monster of a behemoth car, automotive company. But we often know that their F1 outfits are big drains when it comes to finances, and oftentimes the kind of broader companies aren't too thrilled about spending tons of money on an F1 project that's, taking years and years to build. So I think even little things like that, but they've also made the right decision where they've not just purely signed on commercial aspects. They want two drivers that are going to put in good performances and teach them loads. And I mean, look, Cadillac had some interesting options as well. Alex Dunn, the Irish driver who's currently doing incredibly in F2, his name has been floating about in F1. I think that's becoming less and less likely now. He's of course part of the McLaren driver academy. It looks like McLaren are such a strong outfit with such a strong driver lineup that there will be no way in for him in there too. So Cadillac was of course the next one that came up. But I do think it was the right decision. They would be taking a risk bringing a rookie on, and while there's always that kind of interest of a new team bringing a rookie on, who can bring some kind of fresh eyes to things. I think what they need right now is experience, and they need a safe pair of hands as well. I mean, also, there's also the risk when you sign a rookie of someone doing a ton of car damage. And I'm not saying that a rookie would come in and crash the car every weekend, but that is kind of diminished when you've had two drivers who've been in F1 cars for years and years. That being said, I mean, Cadillac have put their hands up and said there is going to be a few challenges this year. They're going to try and get some TPC running, testing of previous cars for our listeners who don't know. But essentially, Cadillac don't have any previous cars, obviously. So they have said that they're in conversations with a few of the other teams to get some running in some other cars. I would imagine that would potentially be Ferrari, considering that they've entered this engine deal as well. But they said they have been speaking to multiple teams. And I think that someone like Perez will definitely value some of that TPC testing, because we're forgetting that Bottas, while being on the sidelines, has been a reserve driver. He has been in and out of F1 cars over the last year or so. So even little things like that, being out of an F1 car for a year, will take a bit of time to get back into again as well. So there's a few things that, a few question marks. There's a few things that are holding Cadillac back a little bit. but I think it's definitely one of the most exciting things to be looking out for next year.
With the Alex Dunn situation and him performing phenomenally at Rodin in the McLaren Driver Academy, um, both of these drivers that they have gone for in Bottas and Perez are on the older side and repeatedly have flirted with retirement. Obviously, Perez wasn't really expecting to necessarily come back into the sport so soon after his exit from Red Bull, and it was a rather similar situation with Valtteri, who very much existed on the fringes of the Mercedes outfit, even in his capacity as a reserve driver. So there is obviously room for changes as these things move on, but again, it is very important in this early stage for them to have the best shot they can and the most experienced set of hands possible. And in their choosing of Perez and Bottas, I think it is an absolutely excellent decision. Lest we also forget that we do have another new constructor entering the sport next year, sort of. I mean, Audi, in their taking over of the stake outfit, has gone for a rather different approach to what Cadillac has. And it's arguable that they have potentially had a tougher time. They've regularly expressed their disappointment in the performance of the Stake Sauber team as it's gone through this year and indeed last year. So it is going to be very interesting to see how these two different approaches pan out and who comes out on top at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's been such a kind of dichotomy of the two kind of massive manufacturers entering F1, and potentially feels like Audi have underestimated what they were getting into sometimes. I mean, it's very early days. They are yet to officially take over the team. But Audi have obviously come in and said that they want to see more from that Stake Sauber team by the time it comes for them to come in and just take over the outfit completely. I mean, I would agree with that too, but also they've made some questionable decisions themselves over the years. Obviously, Andreas Seidel being taken over from McLaren and being brought into the Audi outfit and then being pushed aside. There's definitely been some, controversies, difficult decisions that Audi have made over the years. I think Jonathan Wheatley is a fantastic person to kind of lead that new outfit as well. But as you said, I think the Cadillac entry has been really interesting to see how, I don't want to say like dedicated, but I mean more dedicated than, I'm not saying they're more dedicated than Audi, but it's like they've checked every box at every step of the way. They've done a really good mix of building really good hype of being the 11th team, but also being the American team. And then also building that hype of, yeah, this is going to be a long-term project. This is going to take some time. They are tempering expectations from the start without completely dumping on themselves. They are still saying, like, look, this is going to take time and we want to build towards something better, which is always great. You don't want to be the Alpine approach where you're constantly promising being championship winners within, what was it, 500 races and then 5 years. And then, so I think that it's been a really, really, and I think, as you say, that just reflects in their driver lineup decision. Then it's just everything has been very measured, very, very matured. Every decision has been very logical. And I think that it has all the ingredients to be a really, really interesting start to the season with a new team as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, look, what I think is fantastic as well to see is, you'd mentioned that, Perez and Bottas were two drivers that very much could have just been facing down Formula One retirement. They're two people that you would go, well, I'd like to see them on the grid, but that could just be it. There's been plenty of drivers where they're a little bit older, they're still driving at a high level, but the cards don't fall in the right place and they're gone. And that's just it. They don't get that kind of look back in, and there's always new talent coming up as well. I think what's been interesting is going back to Audi is seeing someone like Nico Hulkenberg and how he has massively resurrected his career. And one of the talking points this season was him scoring that first podium,
Mm.
which was a long held record that he had for most Grand Prix starts without a podium. He finally broke that curse, and it's been fantastic. He's been a really, really excellent addition to that team. He was excellent with Haas, and I think that this kind of era of Formula One is a bit more open to, bringing back those older drivers that were still driving at a higher level. And I think for these kind of teams that are lower down in the standings not having these ridiculous lofty expectations and just understanding that, I mean, ultimately when it comes to winning championships, that's when you want those championship winning drivers. But for where they're at, it's just been a completely really really smart move.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, pragmatism is very important when you're starting up a new team. And it's important to remember that Formula One is an incredibly fickle sport. If performance isn't on the table, then again, need we remind ourselves of Red Bull, things move along very, very quickly indeed. So giving yourself the best start with what you perceive to be strong and proven drivers is particularly important. And yes, Audi/Stake has done a very similar thing with bringing back Nico Hulkenberg. I think it is important to, especially in a new team, start with drivers that you know you can rely on, but also leave space for new talent further down the line. Obviously, having a new team means there is extra space on the grid to have another two drivers driving at any given time. So I think that does definitely open up a lot of opportunities for some of the younger talent we're seeing in the upper ranks of Formula 2 and even further down in Formula 3 for the future, which I think is very promising for the sport in general too.
Great stuff. Well, look, lots to chew on there, Lucas. We're obviously back racing in Zandvoort this weekend, which we are very, very much all looking forward to. Myself and Lucas will be back to give all of our thoughts on the return to the first F1 race of the second half of the season. So thank you very much for tuning in to the first episode of the all-new Crash F1 podcast. Don't forget to follow along and stay up to date with all the latest Formula One news, analysis, and race day insights on crash.net.